Every author dreams of writing a bestseller. They dream of their book being in every airport, on every nightstand, the subject of 1,000 conversations. I achieved that dream. But my story wasn't born from imagination. It was born from betrayal so absolute it hollowed me out and left a ghost in my place. My wife never knew I was writing it. And now, she and her lover have to see their faces, their lies, reflected in the pages of a book that made the entire country despise them. If you've ever been made to feel powerless, if you've ever had your story stolen from you, then you know what it's like to scream into a void. This is a story of how I found my voice again and turned it into a weapon. Stick with me. And if you believe in the power of words, hit that subscribe button. This is a story you'll want to hear to the very end. For 10 years, my life was a novel I thought I was writing. I was Daniel, a moderately successful author of literary fiction. My books were respected. That's the word the critics used. It's a polite word for books that don't sell particularly well, but earn you nods of approval in quiet, dusty corners of the literary world. I lived in a world of metaphors and paragraphs, of ink and introspection. My office was my sanctuary, a small, dark room lined with bookshelves, smelling perpetually of old paper and freshly brewed coffee. It was my cave, where I wrestled with sentences and tried to make sense of the world by putting it into words. And Elena was the light that filtered in under the door. My wife, Elena, was everything my world wasn't. Where my life was quiet and monochromatic, hers was a vibrant, chaotic explosion of color and sound. She was a landscape designer, a job that suited her perfectly. She coaxed life from barren soil. She saw beauty in tangled things. She filled our home with flowers and music and people. When I'd emerge from my study, blinking in the evening light after a long day of writing, she would be there, a glass of wine in her hand, a story on her lips about a difficult client or a beautiful new species of rose she discovered. She was my anchor to the real world. She was a warm, beating heart of our home. Our routines were a comfort. I would wake before dawn, the house still and silent, and write for 3 hours, powered by the bitter coffee I brewed in the dark. I'd hear her stir around 7, the soft padding of her feet on the hardwood floors, the hiss of the espresso machine. She'd bring me a cup, her hand cool on the back of my neck as she leaned down to kiss me. She would whisper a reminder for me not to forget to eat today, calling me her brooding genius, and her laughter would be the first real sound of the day. I believed she was my muse. I dedicated my second novel to her, with the inscription for Elena, The Stillness in the Storm. I genuinely believed it. She was a calm, beautiful reality I could return to when the fictional worlds in my head became too loud. I saw our life as a perfect symbiosis, the reclusive writer and his effervescent, life-affirming wife. A cliché, I know, but I was living in it and it felt profound. The change was so subtle at first. I wrote it off as character development, a new perfume, something musky and expensive that replaced her usual light, floral scent. More nights out, supposedly with her friends, coming home late, smelling of wine and an excitement that seemed to have nothing to do with me. Her phone, which used to lie face up on the kitchen counter, was now always screened down or tucked away in her purse. When I'd ask who she was texting, she would laugh it off, telling me I was being paranoid. She'd claim it was just Maria stressing about her renovation again. She added that I got so lost in my imaginary worlds that I forgot she had a real one. She was right, I told myself. I was a writer. I was paid to be suspicious, to see hidden motives and subtext in every gesture. I was projecting my own fictional drama onto our very real, very happy life. So I ignored the gnawing unease in my gut. I ignored the way she'd sometimes look at me, not with love, but with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Was it pity? Impatience? I pushed it all down and went back to my desk. Trust was the foundation of our house. To question it felt like taking a sledgehammer to a load-bearing wall. The foundation shattered on a Tuesday. It was late, almost 2 a.m. I was stuck on a chapter, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. I needed to check a historical detail, a small fact about 19th century architecture. My laptop was downstairs, but Elena's iPad was on the corner of my desk, where she'd left it earlier. We shared everything. Our finances, our fears, our devices. It never occurred to me not to use it. I picked it up. The screen glowed to life, and so did a notification banner at the top of the screen. A message from a name I didn't recognize. Marcus. He had written that he couldn't stop thinking about that afternoon, and that she was incredible. He then asked about meeting next Tuesday at the same time. The world tilted on its axis. My breath caught in my throat. It felt like I had been submerged in ice water. For a long moment, I just stared at the words, my mind refusing to process them. This afternoon, she'd told me she was at a nursery in the suburbs, sourcing a rare Japanese maple for a client. My hands were trembling, but I managed to unlock the device. Her thumbprint was still registered, right next to mine. I opened her messages, and there it was, not just a crack in the foundation, but a gaping, abyssal canyon. It wasn't just one message. It was weeks, months, an entire novel's worth of a secret life. They had pet names for each other. They had inside jokes. They had a history that had been running concurrently to my own. I saw our life, my life, referencing their texts as a burden, an obstacle. In one message, Elena wrote that she had to go because I was finally emerging from my cave. She promised to call him the next day. Marcus had replied that the genius should have his words, because he and Elena had better things to do. I scrolled and scrolled, each message a fresh stab wound. They talked about my books. He'd asked if he should read one. Her reply was what finally broke me. She told him absolutely not, explaining that they were so heavy and involved so much thinking. She said that living with me was like living with a storm cloud, and that she needed sunshine, which was what Marcus was to her. A storm cloud, the stillness in the storm. My dedication to her, my heartfelt public declaration of love, had become a private joke between her and her lover. I felt the blood drain from my face. A low, roaring sound filled my ears, blocking out the quiet hum of the house. I had spent 10 years building a home with this woman, and I suddenly realized I was living in a stranger's house, a set for a play where I was the only one who didn't know his lines. I didn't storm into the bedroom. I didn't scream. The writer in me, the observer, took over. I sat there in the dark of my study, the blue light of the iPad illuminating my face, and I simply observed the wreckage. I felt a cold, terrifying calm settle over me. I waited until morning. I waited until she brought me my coffee, just like she always did. She leaned down to kiss me. I turned my head slightly, and her lips brushed my cheek instead. She frowned. She asked if everything was okay, her voice bright and unconcerned. I didn't answer. I just turned the iPad around on my desk, the screen still open to her messages with Marcus. The performance was masterful. First confusion, then a flicker of panicked recognition. Then the walls came up. Her face hardened, the warmth vanishing, replaced by a cold, defiant anger. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She attacked. She snapped, asking if I had gone through her private messages. I stated that she had left them on my desk, and then I asked who he was. She crossed her arms, a gesture of war. She told me his name was Marcus, and that he was a man who knew how to live. She said that he didn't spend his life hiding in a room wrestling with sentences, but instead built things, talked to people, and existed in the world. The cruelty was so precise, so surgical. She was targeting the very essence of who I was. My work, my personality, my entire being was being framed as the cause of her betrayal. She continued, claiming that she had needed to breathe and to laugh without having to explain the joke. She said she had needed to feel alive, and asked if that was so hard to understand. She gestured around my study at my books and my life's work, and asked if I had really thought that this was enough for someone like her. There it was, the verdict. I was insufficient. My love, my support, my quiet, steady presence. It was a cage she needed to escape. She wasn't sorry she had cheated. She was sorry she had gotten caught. She saw herself as a victim, a vibrant soul trapped in a library. I said nothing. I just looked at her, at the beautiful, familiar face of the woman I loved, and I saw a stranger, a cold, cruel stranger who had rewritten our entire history to cast herself as a heroine and me as the villain. She hadn't just been unfaithful. She had been contemptuous. She had mocked my love, my work, and my very nature. She waited for me to yell, to break down, to beg. When I remained silent, her anger turned to frustration. She demanded that I say something, telling me to yell at her or to just do something. I finally spoke, my voice barely a whisper. I told her that I thought she should pack a bag. She stared at me for a long moment, then let out a short, bitter laugh. She agreed that it was fine, and turned and walked out of my study, not with the shame of a person exposed, but with the defiant stride of a prisoner being set free. I sat there, alone in the suffocating silence. The smell of her perfume still lingered in the air. The coffee she had brought me was growing cold on my desk. She hadn't just broken my heart. She hadn't just destroyed our marriage. She had taken my story, our story, and burned the pages. She thought my silence was weakness. She thought my stillness was surrender. She had no idea that in the quietest, darkest corners of a writer's heart, the most devastating stories are born. And I was about to write the final chapter of ours. The days that followed her departure were a study in emptiness. Elena didn't just leave. She excavated the life from our house. She took the vibrant rugs, the colorful paintings, the plants that crowded every windowsill. She took the wind chimes that sang on the porch and the antique record player that had filled our evenings with jazz. She moved with a swift, brutal efficiency, aided by two movers who didn't make eye contact with me. I stood in my study doorway and watched as she systematically dismantled our shared world, leaving behind a hollow, echoing shell. What remained was mine, the books, the desk, the bed, the bones of a life, stripped of all its flesh. The silence she left behind was a physical presence. It was heavy and suffocating. I'd walk through the empty rooms and the floorboards would groan under my weight, the sound obscenely loud. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of a clock I never knew we had. Every mundane sound was amplified, a testament to the absence of her laughter, her music, her voice. I was a ghost haunting my own home. My work, my only remaining refuge, became a torture chamber. I would sit at my desk for hours, staring at a blank screen, the cursor blinking like a mocking eye. The words were gone. The intricate worlds I used to build in my mind had collapsed into rubble. How could I write about fictional heartbreak when my own was so colossal it blotted out the sun? How could I craft dialogue when the only words echoing in my head were hers? The memory of her saying it was like living with a storm cloud, that she needed sunshine. I was paralyzed. My agent would call, asking about the new manuscript, the one I was already behind on. I'd make excuses, my voice sounding foreign and distant. I'd lie and say it was coming along, that I was just working through a tricky plot point. The truth was, my plot had been stolen. My protagonist had been assassinated. There was no story left to tell. A writer who cannot write is not a writer. He is just man in a room full of books. The loss of Elena was a wound, but the loss of my words was a mortal one. It was an attack on my very soul. The world, of course, moved on. Our mutual friends, faced with the awkward schism of divorce, mostly drifted toward the sun. They gravitated toward Elena and Marcus. I'd see the evidence on social media. Photos of them at a winery, with people who had been at our wedding. A shot of them laughing on a sailboat. Elena's head thrown back in joy. Marcus's arm wrapped securely around her. She was glowing. She looked happier, more vibrant than I had seen her in years. They weren't hiding. They were celebrating. Their narrative was simple and effective. Elena had bravely left a stifling, unhappy marriage to a reclusive, difficult man. She had chosen life. She had chosen happiness. No one asked for my side of the story. My silence was interpreted as confirmation. I was the storm cloud she had escaped from, and Marcus was her well-deserved sunshine. I saw them once in person. It was about 3 months after she'd left. I was in a bookstore, a place that used to feel like a church to me. Now just another room. I was running my fingers over the spines of books, feeling nothing when I heard her laugh. It was the same sound that used to be the soundtrack of my life. I froze. I looked over the top of a bookshelf, and there they were, in the biography section. Marcus was holding a book, saying something that made her laugh again. He was handsome, I had to admit, in a generic, confident way. He looked like the hero in a blockbuster movie. Solid, easy to understand. I was a complicated, brooding character actor. I knew which one the audience roots for. He leaned in and kissed her, a quick, casual gesture of ownership, right there in the middle of the bookstore. My bookstore. No one else seemed to notice. To the rest of the world, they were just a happy couple in love. To me, it was a lit match dropped on a puddle of gasoline. My heart hammered in my chest. My hands started to sweat. I felt a primal urge to march over there, to yell, to shatter their perfect little moment. But what would I have said? That she was my wife? That he had no right to kiss her there? I would look insane. Pathetic. They would look at me with pity, the crazy ex-husband unable to let go. I would be validating their entire story. So I did nothing. I ducked behind the bookshelf, my back pressed against the hard spines of other people's stories. I waited until they left, their laughter echoing as they walked out the door. I stood there for a long time, breathing heavily, my fists clenched so tight my knuckles were white. The feeling of utter, complete powerlessness was a physical sickness. It rose up from my stomach, a bitter, acidic bile. They had my wife, my home, my friends, my story. I had nothing. I was a footnote in the story of their great romance. That night, I went home and drank. I opened a bottle of whiskey I'd been saving, and I drank until the edges of the room blurred and the crushing weight in my chest eased into a dull, manageable ache. I stumbled to the dark, empty house, the ghost of my own life, and ended up in my study. I slumped into my chair and stared at the blinking cursor on the blank page. This is it, I thought. This is the end of the story. A once respected writer, broken by a cliché, drinking himself into oblivion in a house full of memories. It was a pathetic ending. And then a different thought pushed through the alcoholic haze. A cold, sharp, diamond-hard thought. What if this wasn't the end? What if this was the inciting incident? Every story needs a villain. Elena and Marcus were basking in the glow of being the heroes of their own narrative. But narratives are fragile things. They are built of words. And words were my domain. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought I had no weapons. They had forgotten that I didn't fight with my fists. I fought with paragraphs. I fought with chapters. I fought with a brutal, unflinching truth, sharpened to a razor's edge. I deleted the title of my failed manuscript. My fingers, clumsy from the whiskey but guided by a sudden, terrible clarity, typed a new title. The Echo Chamber. I started to write. I didn't write about my fictional characters. I wrote about a woman named Isabel who filled her husband's house with flowers. I wrote about a writer named Liam who lived in a cave of books. I wrote about the musky scent of a new perfume, about a phone that was always turned face down, about a text message that appeared on a shared iPad in the dead of night. I didn't have to invent the pain. I just had to transcribe it. The words, so long absent, came in a flood. A torrent of rage and grief and meticulous, remembered detail. I wrote through the night, the only sound the frantic clicking of my keyboard. The whiskey bottle was empty, but I was more sober than I had been in months. I wasn't just writing a story. I was building a cage made of words with mirrored walls, so that when my wife looked in, she would see nothing but her own monstrous reflection. Over and over again, the ghost was finally speaking, and his voice was going to be a scream. The book became my world. The sun would rise and set outside my study window, but I barely noticed. I lived inside the pages, inside the last year of my marriage. It was a harrowing, masochistic process. To write it, I had to relive everything. I had to force myself back into the moments of quiet suspicion, the gut-wrenching moment of discovery, the cold, final cruelty of our last conversation. I had to remember the exact phrasing of her lies, the specific cadence of his condescending tone in the text messages. It was like performing surgery on my own heart without anesthetic. But something strange happened in the process. The pain, which had been a form of paralysis, became a fuel. Every memory that had once haunted me, I now hunted. I dragged each one out into the light, pinned it to the page like a specimen, and dissected it with cold, unforgiving precision. The act of writing it down, of containing the chaos within the structure of a narrative, was an act of reclaiming power. The memories no longer own me. I own them. I created my fictional avatars with meticulous care. The husband, Liam, was me, but stripped down to the bone, his grief and confusion amplified. I poured every ounce of my own humiliation and helplessness into him, making him a raw nerve of a character that I knew readers would instinctively ache for. The lover, Julian, was a caricature of Marcus, but one rooted in truth. I named him Julian because it sounded slick and vaguely European, a name that tried too hard. I made him a flashy wealth manager who spoke in cliches about synergy and disruption. I took Marcus's confidence and magnified it into an unbearable arrogance. I took his charm and twisted it into a smarmy, predatory slickness. I included small, damning details I had gleaned from his social media profiles, his love for ostentatious watches, his habit of posting inspirational quotes over pictures of his luxury car. But Isabel was my masterpiece of quiet vengeance. I didn't make her a one-dimensional villain. That would have been too easy, too dismissible. Instead, I built her from the ground up, using Elena as the blueprint. I gave Isabel my wife's enchanting laugh, her talent for making a room feel like a home, her love of wild, untamed gardens. I made her charismatic, beautiful, and deeply sympathetic in the book's opening chapters. I wanted the reader to fall in love with her, just as I had. Then, slowly, I began to weave in the poison. I showed her casual deceptions, her growing contempt for Liam's quiet nature, her hunger for a grander, more dramatic life. I used her exact words, the ones that were seared into my brain. The line about Liam being a storm cloud, the condescending way she talked about his work. I put the text messages from Marcus into the book, changing only the names, preserving the cruel, intimate shorthand of their affair. By the time Isabel betrays Liam in the novel, I wanted the reader to feel the betrayal as a personal wound. I wasn't just telling a story. I was building an indictment piece by piece and making the reader the jury. After 4 months of frenzied, sleepless work, I had a finished manuscript. It was 400 pages of raw, unfiltered truth, wrapped in the thinnest possible veil of fiction. It was the most honest, brutal, and best thing I had ever written. I sent it to my agent, Sarah, with a simple note, telling her that this was a new book. She called me 2 days later. Her voice was strained. She asked me what it was. I replied that it was the book. She confessed that she'd had to put it down 3 times, calling it devastating and saying that it felt incredibly real. I confirmed that it was. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. She said okay, and told me that she wasn't going to ask for details. But she said she had to ask if I was sure I wanted to publish this. She described it as a departure for me, calling it commercial, visceral, and cruel. Brilliantly so, but still cruel. I told her I was sure. I said I had never been more sure of anything. Sarah was a great agent. She saw the commercial potential, but she also saw the landmines. The first few publishers we sent it to agreed. They loved the writing, the raw emotion, the undeniable commercial hook. But they were scared. One editor wrote in a rejection letter that it was too personal, that it read like a revenge fantasy, and that they could be opening themselves up to a lawsuit. The rejection stung. It was a new kind of helplessness. I had forged my pain into a weapon, and now it seemed no one would let me wield it. I started to doubt. Was this all a terrible mistake? A pathetic, literary cry for help that would never see the light of day? Was Elena right? Was I just a man in a room, arranging words that would never touch the real world? But Sarah believed in it. She finally found a home for it at a smaller, bolder press, with a young, ambitious editor named Mark, who wasn't afraid of a little controversy. Mark called me after he read it. He told me with excitement that the book was going to be huge. He argued that it wasn't a revenge fantasy, but an anthem for anyone who had ever been betrayed. He laid out his plan to lean into that, explaining that they wouldn't be publishing a quiet literary novel, but a cultural event. The machine started to move. The book went through edits, copy editing, cover design. Seeing the story of my life's greatest trauma being discussed in marketing meetings and scheduled for a spring publication date was a surreal experience. It was no longer just my pain. It was a product, a commodity. I requested one thing during the cover design process. I asked them to use a specific flower in the artwork, a Japanese anemone. It was a beautiful, delicate white flower with a dark center. It was Elena's favorite. She had planted them all along the walkway to our front door. It was a detail no one but she would ever understand. A final, secret twist of the knife, just for her. A few months later, a box arrived at my door. I opened it. Inside were 10 advance copies of The Echo Chamber. My name was on the cover. Underneath it, the title, and woven into the design, a single, perfect Japanese anemone. I held the book in my hands. It was heavy, solid, real. The story of my humiliation and grief was now a physical object. It was no longer a ghost haunting my mind. It was a weapon, forged and ready. I ran my thumb over the flower on the cover. For the first time in over a year, I didn't feel like a victim. I didn't feel helpless. I felt a cold, calm, and thrilling sense of anticipation. The story was about to be told. And this time, I was the only one holding the pen. The Echo Chamber was released on a Tuesday in April with little fanfare. There was no big launch party, no major ad campaign. Mark, my editor, had been right. This was a book that would build by word of mouth. And it did. It started as a murmur, a whisper in book clubs and online forums. A woman in Ohio would post about it, saying the book had destroyed her and that she had loved every second of it because the author just got it. A man in California would tweet that if you've ever been cheated on, you needed to read The Echo Chamber, calling it a survival guide. The murmur grew into a buzz. It was praised for its raw honesty, its unflinching portrayal of betrayal. Readers didn't see it as fiction. They saw it as testimony. The character of Liam became a vessel for their own heartbreaks. And the character of Isabel became a universal villain. Talk shows discussed her breathtaking narcissism. Magazine articles analyzed the psychology of the modern cheater, using her as a case study. People didn't just dislike Isabel. They despised her with a passion, usually reserved for real-life criminals. And then the book exploded. A major celebrity posted a picture of it on her Instagram, calling it the most devastatingly honest book of the year. That post was a lit fuse. The book shot to the top of the bestseller list and stayed there. My face was on television, in newspapers. I was a quiet, literary writer who had suddenly, shockingly, tapped into the cultural zeitgeist. In interviews, I was careful. I spoke about the book in universal terms, as a work of fiction exploring the themes of betrayal and memory. I never once mentioned my own life. I didn't have to. The book was doing all the talking for me. I didn't hear from Elena for the first month. I imagined at first she didn't even know. She didn't read my books. After all, she had said they were too heavy. But she couldn't have avoided this one. It was everywhere. I wondered who told her first. A friend, calling her with a strange tone in her voice, perhaps asking if she'd seen my new book, and commenting that the character Isabel seemed familiar. The first sign that the message had been received was an email. The sender was simply... The subject line was a single word asking how. The body of the email was a torrent of rage. She demanded to know how I could have and how I had dared. She accused me of taking our life, her life, and twisting it into filth for the whole world to read. She said I had made her a monster, insisting that it was just a character in a book and that it wasn't her. I read the email, and I felt nothing but a calm, detached satisfaction. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't repentant. She was just furious that her narrative had been hijacked. I archived the email without replying. A week later, the voicemail started. The first one was angry, threatening lawsuits for defamation. She shrieked that I had no proof, that I had changed the names, but that her friends and family knew. She accused me of ruining her life. The second voicemail, a few days later, was different. Her voice was trembling, pleading. She begged me to make a statement, to tell people that it wasn't based on real life. She said that people were looking at her strangely and whispering. She claimed Marcus's clients were asking questions, and that I didn't understand what I had done. I understood perfectly. I had taken away her sunshine. I had created a storm cloud that followed her everywhere. The public condemnation of the fictional Isabel was bleeding into the real world, staining Elena, The details in the book were too specific to be a coincidence. The Japanese anemones on the cover, the exact phrasing of her cruelest remarks, the pet names. Anyone who knew us, even casually, could connect the dots. They were reading a best-selling novel and then looking at my ex-wife and seeing the villain from Page, standing right in front of them. The final voicemail was the one that told me the war was over. It came late at night. Her voice was defeated, hollowed out. She whispered, her voice thick with tears, that she had gone to a dinner party that night. She said no one would talk to her. They had just stared. She recounted hearing a woman in the kitchen call her Isabel, not Elena. She concluded that I had done it, that I had erased her. Through sobs, she asked if I was happy. I deleted the voicemail. I didn't feel happy. Happiness was too simple a word. I felt balanced. The profound, public humiliation she was experiencing was a perfect echo of the private, silent humiliation she had put me through. It was justice, written in prose. I saw her one last time, about a year after the book came out. I was in my car, stopped at a red light. She was walking on the sidewalk. She looked diminished. The vibrant, confident light she had carried was gone. Her shoulders were slumped. She was looking at the ground as she walked, as if she didn't want to meet anyone's eyes. She looked like a woman haunted by a ghost. In a way, she was haunted by Isabel. And Marcus? I heard through the grapevine that his business had taken a hit. Trust is a valuable commodity for a wealth manager, and being publicly revealed as a smarmy, adulterous Julian from a national bestseller is not good for business. And it had withered under the glare. They're perfect. My revenge life had been put under, but it was never really about them. It was about me. It was about a man who lost his voice and had to scream his pain onto the page to find it again. I had taken the worst experience of my life and performed a kind of alchemy, transforming my grief into art, my powerlessness into a cultural phenomenon. The book isn't my story anymore. It belongs to the readers now. It belongs to every person who has ever felt the sting of betrayal and found a piece of their own experience in its pages. At my book signings, people don't ask me if the story is true. They come up to me, their own copies of the book clutched in their hands, and they tell me their stories. They thank me for giving a voice to their pain. I never set out to destroy Elena. I set out to save myself. But she had built her new life on the ashes of my old one, and she never thought to look back at the man she left burning in the ruins. She forgot that writers have the final word. Always. She and Marcus are now just characters in a story I wrote, a story that will sit on shelves long after all of us are gone. Their betrayal is immortalized. My pain has been redeemed, and my silence, the silence she mistook for weakness, became the loudest thing of all. They say the pen is mightier than the sword. What do you think? Is this the perfect revenge, or a step too far? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of a story to change a life, or to end one, consider subscribing for more tales of intricate justice. Thank you for listening.